The ocean was on fire. From 3,000 feet above Truk Lagoon, I could see the apocalypse spread across the waters like spilled gasoline touched by a match. Japanese ships burned in every direction, destroyers listing heavily to port, their superstructures glowing orange against the morning sky. A cruiser's magazine had just detonated, sending a column of black smoke a mile into the air. Fuel oil spread in rainbow slicks between the coral atolls, and floating debris told the story of vessels that had simply vanished beneath the waves. This was February 17, 1944, and I was watching the Gibraltar of the Pacific die. My name is Lieutenant James "Jimmy" Sullivan, and I flew an SBD-5 Dauntless bomber from the carrier USS Enterprise. What I witnessed that day would haunt me for the rest of my life, not because of what we did, but because of how completely we did it. It had all started 6 hours earlier, in the pre-dawn darkness of Task Force 58. Admiral Nimitz had assembled the most powerful naval strike force in history. 9 fast carriers, 6 battleships, and dozens of cruisers and destroyers. Our target was Truk Atoll, the heavily fortified Japanese naval base that controlled the Central Pacific. For 2 years, this place had been untouchable, earning its nickname as Japan's Gibraltar. But Admiral Nimitz had decided it was time to kick down the door. I remember standing on Enterprise's flight deck at 0400 hours, watching the deck crews prep our Dauntless for what promised to be the mission of our lives. My rear gunner, aviation radioman second class Tony Marchetti from Brooklyn, was already strapped into his seat, checking his twin. 30 caliber machine guns for the 3rd time. "You nervous, Sully?" Tony called over the rumble of warming engines. "Nah," I lied, pulling on my leather flight helmet. "Just another milk run." The truth was, my hands were shaking as I climbed into the cockpit. Truk wasn't just any target, it was the heart of Japanese naval power in the Pacific. Intelligence reports suggested over 40 warships anchored in the lagoon, plus hundreds of aircraft on 5 different airfields. If the Japanese were waiting for us, this could turn into a massacre. At 0630 hours, the first wave launched. I was in the 2nd strike group, scheduled to hit the anchorage at 0900. As our formation of 12 Dauntless bombers climbed to 15,000 feet, I could see the massive armada spread across the ocean below us. Never before had so many American carriers operated together. The sight filled me with a fierce pride and a terrible responsibility. "Contact bearing 40, Angels 12, came the voice of our fighter escort leader over the radio. "Zeke's climbing to intercept." I craned my neck and spotted them, a dozen Japanese A6M Zero fighters, rising like angry wasps from Eden Island. But they were too late and too few. Our F6F Hellcats dove on them immediately, and within minutes, 3 Zeros were spinning into the sea, trailing smoke and flame. "This is Badger Leader," called Commander Wade McCluskey, our strike group commander. "Target in sight. All units, prepare for attack." And there it was, Truk Lagoon spread before us like a vast blue bowl ringed by coral islands and absolutely packed with Japanese shipping. I counted at least 30 major vessels at anchor, from massive battleships to sleek destroyers. It was the largest concentration of enemy warships I'd ever seen. Tony whispered over the intercom, "Look at all those ships." The first wave had already been at work. Columns of smoke rose from several vessels, and I could see the tiny specks of American dive bombers pulling out of their attacks. But there were still plenty of targets left for us. "Badger 2 through 6, take the destroyers on the north side," McCluskey ordered. 7 through 12, you're with me on that heavy cruiser. I was Badger 8, which put me in McCluskey's group. Our target was a Takao-class heavy cruiser anchored near Dublin Island, 8-inch guns, 8,000 tons of steel, and probably 600 Japanese sailors. She was turning now, trying to get underway, her wake beginning to foam white behind her stern. "Beginning attack run," I called, pushing the stick forward and diving toward the enemy warship. The world transformed in an instant. The peaceful blue ocean rushed up to meet us at 200 miles per hour, and suddenly the air around our plane erupted with black puffs of anti-aircraft fire. The Japanese had been caught by surprise, but they weren't going down without a fight. At 10,000 feet, I could make out individual gun mounts in the cruiser's deck, their barrels swinging frantically to track our approach. Tracer rounds streaked past my canopy like deadly fireflies. One burst so close I could smell the cordite. "Stay with her, Sully," Tony shouted from the rear seat. "You got her lined up perfect." 8,000 feet. 6,000. The cruiser grew larger and larger in my bomb sight, her rising sun flag clearly visible now. I could see Japanese sailors running across her decks, some manning anti-aircraft guns, others just trying to find cover. 4,000 feet. This was the moment of truth, the point where dive bomber pilots earned their pay. Too high on do miss. Too low and the blast from your own bomb kills you. At exactly 3,000 feet, I centered the crosshairs on the cruiser's forward smokestack and pressed the bomb release. "Bomb away," I called, hauling back on the stick and feeling 6G slam me into my seat. The 1,000-pound bomb fell away from my Dauntless like a deadly teardrop. I pulled out of the dive and looked back just in time to see it strike the cruiser amidships, right between her two main smokestacks. The explosion was tremendous, a brilliant orange flash followed by a towering column of black smoke and debris. "Direct hit," Tony screamed. "You nailed her, Sully." But there was no time to celebrate. Zero fighters were diving on us from above, and I had to focus on staying alive. I pushed the throttle forward and dove for the deck, skimming just 50 feet above the lagoon's surface. Behind me, I could hear Tony's machine guns chattering as he engaged the pursuing Zero. "He's coming around for another pass," Tony called. "Brake left." I threw the Dauntless into a sharp left turn, and the Zero's cannon shells splashed harmlessly into the water where we'd been a second before. Our Hellcat escort came screaming down, and the Zero pilot, seeing he was outnumbered, broke off and fled toward the protection of his airfield. Now I had a chance to look around and assess the damage we were inflicting. The sight was almost beyond belief. The heavy cruiser I'd hit was listing heavily to starboard, her forward magazine clearly destroyed. 2 destroyers were dead in the water, their superstructures blown away. A light cruiser was sinking by the stern, her crew abandoning ship. But the most spectacular destruction was occurring on the far side of the lagoon, where the torpedo bombers had found a concentration of tankers and transport ships. One after another, the fuel-laden vessels exploded in massive fireballs that sent shock waves rippling across the water. The sky was turning black with smoke. "My God," I whispered. This wasn't just an attack, it was an annihilation. As we formed up for theft flight back to Enterprise, I could see the full scope of what Task Force 58 had accomplished. Burning and sinking ships dotted the lagoon in every direction. The Japanese airfields on the surrounding islands were carpeted with wrecked aircraft, fighters, bombers, and seaplanes destroyed on the ground before they could even take off. "Badger leader to all units," came McCluskey's voice over the radio. "Outstanding work, gentlemen. Let's head home." The flight back to our carriers was like a victory parade. Everywhere I looked, American planes were returning from successful strikes. F6F Hellcats flew lazy circles around the task force, having shot down dozens of Japanese fighters. TBF Avenger torpedo bombers came back empty, their deadly fish delivered to enemy hulls. And Dauntless dive bombers like mine carried tales of direct hits and destroyed targets. But it wasn't over yet. As we approached the Enterprise, I could see another strike group launching from her deck. This was going to be a 2-day operation, and tomorrow would bring even more destruction to the Japanese fortress. Landing on a carrier deck is always a challenge, but that day I greased it perfectly. The arresting wire caught our tailhook, and we slammed to a stop in less than 200 feet. As I climbed out of the cockpit, my plane captain, Chief Petty Officer Murphy was there to greet me. "How'd it go, Lieutenant?" Murphy asked. "We hammered them, Chief," I replied, pulling off my flight helmet. I've never seen anything like it. Tony was already out of his rear seat, practically dancing with excitement. "Did you see that cruiser blow up? What a sight!" That evening in the ready room, the intelligence officers debriefed us on the day's results. The numbers were staggering. In a single day, Task Force 58 had sunk 2 light cruisers, 4 destroyers, 3 auxiliaries, and dozens of smaller vessels. We destroyed over 200 Japanese aircraft, both in the air and on the ground. And this was just the first day. Commander McCluskey stood before the assembled pilots, his face grim despite your success. "Gentlemen, you've struck a blow against the Japanese Navy that they won't recover from. But remember, those were real ships with real sailors aboard. Honor your enemy, even in victory." That night, I lay in my bunk listening to the sound of the next strike group launching. Through the bulkhead, I could hear the rumble of aircraft engines and the thump of catapults firing. The Enterprise never stopped. She was a floating city of destruction, and tomorrow she would deliver more death to Truk Lagoon. February 18th dawned clear and calm, perfect flying weather. I was scheduled for the morning strike, and as I climbed into my Dauntless, I noticed something different about the atmosphere. The previous day had been tense with uncertainty. We'd been attacking the unknown. Today felt more businesslike, almost routine. We were professionals going to work. The flight to Truk took 45 minutes, and as we approached the target area, I was shocked by what I saw. The lagoon looked like a graveyard. Dozens of ships lay on the bottom in the shallow water, their masts and superstructures still visible above the surface. Oil slicks covered thousands of acres, and the air was thick with smoke from fires that had burned all night. Tony whispered over the intercom. We really did a number on them, but there were still targets left. Intelligence had identified a damaged heavy cruiser trying to escape through the North Pass, and our job was to finish her off. She was the Argano, a modern light cruiser that had been hit the previous day, but was still capable of making way. As we dove on the fleeing warship, I could see she was already badly damaged. Her forward turret was gone, replaced by a gaping hole, and she was trailing oil. But her anti-aircraft guns were still firing, sending up streams of tracers that looked like deadly streamers in the morning sun. This time, I aimed for her engine room. At 3,000 feet, I released my bomb and pulled up hard, feeling the familiar crushing weight of G-forces. The 1,000-pounder struck her amidships, right where I'd aimed, and the explosion lifted her entire stern out of the water. When the smoke cleared, the Argano was finished. She rolled over and sank within minutes, taking most of her crew with her. I watched the Japanese sailors struggling in the oil-covered water and felt a strange mixture of triumph and sorrow. By noon on February 18th, Operation Hailstone was effectively over. Task Force 58 had destroyed the Japanese naval base at Truk so completely that it would never again threaten American operations in the Central Pacific. Admiral Nimitz's strategy had worked perfectly. Instead of invading and capturing Truk at enormous cost in American lives, we had simply bypassed it and rendered it impotent. The final tally was almost beyond belief. In 2 days of operations, we had sunk 3 light cruisers, 4 destroyers, 6 submarines, and over 30 auxiliary vessels. We destroyed 270 Japanese aircraft and damaged countless installations on the ground. The Japanese Navy's forward base in the Central Pacific had been eliminated as an effective fighting force. But as I flew back to Enterprise for the last time, watching the smoke columns rising from Truk's Lagoon, I found myself thinking about the human cost of our victory. Thousands of Japanese sailors and airmen had died in those burning ships and crashed aircraft. They had been our enemies, yes, but they had also been young men like us, far from home and fighting for their country. The sight of that oil-slick graveyard would stay with me forever. Not because I felt guilty about what we'd done, The attack on Pearl Harbor had settled any moral qualms about fighting Japan. But because I had witnessed the awesome, terrible power of modern warfare when fully unleashed. In just 2 days, we had destroyed the work of years and the lives of thousands. As Enterprise turned away from Truk and headed back toward Pearl Harbor, I stood on the flight deck and watched their smoke fade into the distance. The Gibraltar of the Pacific was no more. Japan's defensive perimeter in the Central Pacific had been shattered, and the road to the Philippines, and ultimately to Japan itself, now lay open. But victory, I had learned, always comes with a price. And sometimes the price is paid not just by the defeated, but by the victors who must carry the weight of what they've done. The burning ocean at Truk Lagoon had shown me the face of total war, and it was a face I would never forget. The war in the Pacific would continue for another 18 months, with more battles, more victories, and more terrible destruction. But for me, the image that would always define that conflict wasn't the moment of triumph when Japanese planes crashed into Pearl Harbor's waters. It was the sight of that burning lagoon at Truk, where the ocean itself seemed to be on fire, and where I learned that in war, even victory can leave scars on a man's soul. As I write this story now, more than 70 years later, I can still see Tony Marchetti's excited face when we scored that direct hit on the cruiser. I can still hear Commander McCluskey's voice on the radio, calm and professional even in the heat-off battle. And I can still smell the smoke and oil that rose from Truk Lagoon like incense from some terrible altar of war. We had broken the back of Japanese naval power in the Central Pacific, and in doing so, we had hastened the end of the most destructive war in human history. But the cost, measured not just in ships and planes destroyed, but in the innocence lost by young men like me who had to rain death from the sky, was something we would carry with us for the rest of our lives. The thunder over Truk had been deafening, but the silence that followed, the silence of a graveyard lagoon under the Pacific sun, was somehow even more profound.